At dawn on a wind-bitten morning in 1939, the fields of Windmore lay unnaturally still, as if the land itself were holding its breath. A lone crane towered above the frost-dusted grass, its steel arms silhouetted against a sky the color of bruised porcelain. Below it, the wrecking ball hung motionless, glistening with dew, an iron planet waiting to collide with a world already half in ruins. Men stood in silence, collars turned up, their breath rising in pale clouds as they stared at the giant before them. Whitemarsh Hall loomed across the grounds, its limestone facade washed in the weak morning light, looking less like a house and more like a fallen empire refusing to surrender its last heartbeat. A century of ambition, money, and memory had been poured into those walls. Galleries where orchestras once soared now echoed with only the low groan of winter wind. Trumbauer's masterpiece, Rodman Wanamaker's monument to permanence, stood on the edge of extinction, its beauty almost unbearable in the fragile quiet. The first strike hadn't come yet, but everyone present felt it approaching, the way one feels a storm before the sky splits open. And then the crane shifted, cables tightening, the wrecking ball beginning its slow, terrible rise, marking the final seconds before America's grandest forgotten palace met its fate. Just after sunrise on a cool April morning in 1921, a pale mist clung to the rolling fields of Windmore, drifting low over the grass like a slow-moving tide. Workers arrived in small clusters, their coats buttoned tight against the lingering chill, boots darkening with dew as they crossed the quiet farmland. And then, as the fog thinned, the first shape appeared, an immense limestone facade emerging with the deliberate majesty of something not built, but revealed. Whitemarsh Hall rose from the earth gradually, as if the land itself had been instructed to yield magnificence. The sound of chisels striking stone carried across the grounds in crisp metallic rhythms. Carpenters shouted instructions from scaffolding 4 stories high, their voices muted by distance, swallowed by the sheer size of the structure taking form. At 300 feet long and crowned with a balustrade that stretched nearly the width of a city block, the mansion seemed determined to redefine what an American home could be. Neighbors in nearby Chestnut Hill whispered that it felt foreign, more like an English estate planted by accident on Pennsylvania soil, too vast for the eye to take in at once. Inside the temporary construction offices, blueprints were pinned to every wall. Horace Trumbauer's careful hand dominated them. Symmetry, grandeur, exacting geometry. He moved through the site with the calm certainty of a man accustomed to building dreams for America's wealthiest families. But this project felt different, even to him. This was not merely a house for Rodman and Fernanda Wanamaker. It was a proclamation, a monument to a department store empire that had grown from a single Philadelphia shop into a force that shaped how the nation consumed. By the time the workers paused for their mid-morning break, the sun had risen fully, turning the disappearing mist into a thin silver haze around the mansion's ascending walls. Its presence already reshaped the landscape, casting shadows far longer than any home had the right to. If you are enjoying this video, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support really helps us grow and motivates us to keep creating more content. And don't forget to share it with someone who might enjoy it too. It means a lot to us. And as the light shifted across the limestone, one truth became unmistakable. Whitemarsh Hall was not designed to be admired briefly. It was meant to dominate. By the summer of 1921, the fog no longer hid Whitemarsh Hall. Its limestone walls gleamed openly beneath the Pennsylvania sun, a pale colossus rising above the fields with the solemn authority of a European dynasty. Each morning, Rodman Wanamaker arrived from Philadelphia in a chauffeur-driven car, stepping out with a quiet deliberation that made workers straighten instinctively. He was not a man given to dramatic gestures. His influence stretched from commerce to culture, from aviation patronage to world expositions. Yet here, among the scaffolds and the scent of fresh-cut timber, he moved with a reverence usually reserved for sacred spaces. For Rodman, this was not merely a residence, it was an inheritance made tangible, a continuation of the legacy begun by his father, John Wanamaker, the merchant who transformed American retail by treating customers as citizens instead of transactions. Contemporaries believed Rodman wanted Whitemarsh Hall to embody that same philosophy, grandeur without vulgarity, elegance without excess. Still, the scale of the project betrayed deeper intentions. Some whispered that Rodman sought permanence in an age already shifting beneath its own ambitions, that this mansion was meant to stand as a declaration that the Wanamaker name would endure long after fortunes changed and fashions faded. Fernanda, his wife, visited with her own air of purpose. She drifted through the unfinished rooms, her gloved hand brushing the raw limestone, imagining tapestries, music, the timbre of voices carried through great halls. Her tastes leaned toward refinement rather than ostentation, yet she understood the symbolic weight of the estate they were creating. Whitemarsh Hall would be a stage upon which their family's narrative, its wealth, its influence, its aspirations, would unfold. Workers paused when Rodman and Fernanda passed, sensing in their presence a mix of ambition and destiny. The couple's quiet determination infused every beam and archway, every garden wall and corridor. And as construction pressed forward, the task facing architect Horace Trumbauer grew increasingly immense, shaping not just a mansion, but a monument that attempted to freeze a moment of American prosperity in stone. By early 1922, the estate resembled a vast open-air workshop, and at its center moved Horace Trumbauer, hat tilted forward, coat fluttering behind him as he crossed from one wing of the mansion to the other with a stride that betrayed both urgency and vision. Trumbauer was no stranger to opulence. He had designed marble halls for financiers, libraries for philanthropists, and palatial residences for families who believed their lineage deserved architectural immortality. But Whitemarsh Hall dwarfed even his most extravagant commissions. It demanded not just skill, but surrender, a willingness to let ambition rise higher than practicality. The staff watched him with a mixture of awe and bewilderment. He carried a small leather notebook filled with sketches and notes, its edges softened from constant use. Trumbauer paused often, sometimes mid-stride, sometimes atop a scaffold, his gaze lifting toward the unfinished cornices or the long, unbroken facade. He spoke sparingly, but when he did, carpenters and masons leaned in. His language was precise, setbacks measured in fractions, window proportions calibrated to control the flow of light, the limestone joints aligned so cleanly they appeared drawn rather than carved. The mansion reflected his devotion. Its symmetry was almost hypnotic, 300 feet of disciplined geometry, framed by terraces and balustrades that echoed the stateliness of English country houses. Workers compared its emerging silhouette to a government building, a museum, a palace. Some joked that it looked more like a national institution than a private home. In truth, Trumbauer was crafting something that blurred boundaries. It was domestic architecture pushed past the edge of reason into something mythic, a structure that could not fully belong to a family because it did not fully belong to the ordinary world. Occasionally, A breeze carried the scent of wet stone and earth across the grounds, stirring the dust around Trumbauer's boots. He would pause, eyes narrowing, as though listening to the future inhabitants moving through rooms not yet built. And as interior crews began arriving with crates of marble, oak paneling, and chandeliers imported from Europe, the mansion's transformation shifted inward, towards spaces that would soon reveal the staggering scale of life within Whitemarsh Hall. By late 1922, the exterior no longer concealed the enormity within. When workers pushed open the unfinished doors each morning, a cavernous hush greeted them, an interior so vast it seemed to swallow sound, swallowing even the memory of the farmland that once lay here. Dust motes drifted in slow spirals through shafts of pale winter light, revealing the outlines of rooms that felt less like parts of a house and more like provinces within a kingdom. The entrance hall stretched out like a ceremonial thoroughfare, its limestone walls rising in cool, unbroken plains that held the echo of footsteps with cathedral-like restraint. Electric wiring, still a novelty in much of America, threaded through the ceilings, promising illumination that would turn these spaces into evening landscapes of shadow and gleam. Marble slabs waited in crates stamped with Italian markings, their veins soft as smoke, destined for fireplaces, stair treads, and bathrooms whose scale defied domestic logic. Beyond the hall lay the grand staircase, an architectural gesture so commanding that even seasoned craftsmen paused before it. Broad as a stage and curving with a sculptural seriousness, it rose toward a landing framed by tall arched windows that caught the morning sun. Standing at its base, a worker once remarked that he felt as though he should remove his hat, as if he were entering a sovereign court. The remark lingered, repeated in whispers among the crew. Farther in, rooms multiplied, drawing rooms large enough to host orchestras, a dining hall that could seat more guests than most hotels, a library waiting for shelves that would bow under the weight of thousands of volumes. Every corridor stretched farther than expected. Every doorway opened not into a room, but into another world, measured in yards rather than feet. And as the mansion's interior continued to swell into its own impossible scale, the rhythms of daily life soon to fill it. Servants, guests, rituals began to take shape, revealing the hidden machinery required to make Whitemarsh Hall breathe. By the spring of 1923, Whitemarsh Hall no longer felt like a construction site. It felt like a stage preparing for its actors. The first to inhabit it were not the Wanamakers, but the servants, moving through unfinished corridors with the instinctive precision of people who understood that a house this size required choreography. Before dawn, the kitchens, 3 of them, stacked like a hidden engine, filled with the hiss of boiling water, the clatter of copper pots, the low hum of voices discussing menus, deliveries, and the day's-long chain of tasks. Footsteps echoed differently here. Padded by service hallways meant never to meet the polished floors of the main rooms. A bell system laced the house, 54 buttons wired to a control panel that blinked like a mechanical constellation. A press from the drawing room summoned a footman. A ring from the upstairs gallery brought a maid. Downstairs, staff memorized the codes like musicians reading notes, their days unfolding in measured sequences that left no room for misstep. Contemporaries who toured the house later marveled that it operated less like a residence and more like a grand hotel, yet all of it existed to support a single family and their guests. The Wanamakers arrived gradually, Fernanda oversaw the placement of tapestries, the hanging of portraits, the arrangement of French and English antiques that filled the rooms with a warmth the stone alone could not provide. When the first gatherings began, the mansion came alive in a way no blueprint had fully predicted. String quartets played beneath ceilings so high their music seemed to drift upward into the dark. Lanterns cast soft halos along the terrace, where guests, wrapped in evening shawls, looked out over gardens stretching into shadowed distance. Servants moved silently through doorways, replenishing glasses before they were empty, anticipating requests before they were spoken. Whitemarsh Hall functioned with effortless grace, its beauty masking an underlying truth. Even paradise required an army to maintain its illusion. And as the years progressed, that illusion would face pressures, economic, cultural, and personal, that no mansion, however magnificent, could entirely suppress. By the late 1920s, the quiet rhythms of Whitemarsh Hall had settled into a kind of practiced grandeur, meals served with clockwork elegance, gardens trimmed with mathematical precision, entertainments unfolding beneath chandeliers that cast their brilliance across marble floors. Yet beneath that polished surface, the first tremors of strain had begun to stir. They were faint at first, almost imperceptible, like the subtle shift of earth beneath a great estate, a missed delivery, a postponed gala, a servant mentioning, only once, the rising cost of coal needed to heat a house the size of a small village. Outside the gates, America was tilting. The department store empire that had buoyed the Wanamaker's fortune found itself facing new pressures, changing consumer habits, the spread of chain stores, and economic uncertainty threading through cities and towns with increasing persistence. Rodman Wanamaker, once confident and tireless, grew more reflective during his visits to the house. Those who saw him walking the long gallery on quiet afternoons said he carried an expression that did not belong to a man at the height of prosperity. It was the look of someone measuring the future with a precision he had not needed before. The cost of maintaining Whitemarsh Hall, its platoon of servants, its fleets of chauffeurs, its endless repairs, mounted quietly, never discussed aloud but felt in the tightening of household routines. Fernanda began hosting fewer elaborate dinners, favoring smaller gatherings that required less orchestration. Rooms once filled with weekly visitors now stood silent for days, their fireplaces cold, their vastness echoing with a subtle, uneasy stillness. Even Trumbauer's flawless limestone facade could not hide the truth that the era for which the mansion had been built was beginning to slip away. Architectural journals praised Whitemarsh Hall as a masterpiece, yet more of them spoke with nostalgia than admiration, as though describing a world already fading. And as the nation edged closer to the fractures that would soon reshape every fortune, the great house in Windmore braced, silently, massively, for the shadows gathering beyond its gates. When the stock market buckled in October 1929, the shock traveled swiftly across the country, but in Windmore, it arrived like a change in weather, felt first in small shifts, then in chilling waves. The groundskeepers at Whitemarsh Hall noticed it before anyone said a word. Deliveries grew irregular, garden projects halted mid-design, tools left resting against half-dug earth. Servants whispered of canceled entertainments. Even the great house itself felt altered, its echoing corridors holding attention sharper than the autumn air. Rodman Wanamaker had died in 1928, leaving behind a family grappling with both grief and the immense machinery required to sustain the estate. Without his relentless drive at the helm, The Wanamaker empire strained under the economic collapse. Department stores, once elegant beacons of American consumer confidence, struggled as customers tightened their spending. Revenues dipped, investments soured. Suddenly, the cost of operating Whitemarsh Hall, once absorbed effortlessly by the family's fortune, loomed like a silent adversary. Inside the house, rooms began to retreat from daily use. The West Wing grew quiet, its long gallery lit only by the thin winter sun that filtered through tall windows. Fireplaces once tended around the clock now sat cold to save coal. Servants who had moved through the mansion with rhythmic certainty found their numbers thinning, their routines compressed. Some left voluntarily, sensing what was coming. Others were dismissed with discreet envelopes and expressions heavy with apology. Fernanda drifted through her home with increasing weariness. She paused often before portraits of Rodman, before tapestries they had chosen together, before windows that looked out onto gardens now too costly to maintain. Those who visited during these years described her as gracious but shadowed, as though she was guarding something precious slipping through her fingers. Whitemarsh Hall remained magnificent, its limestone unblemished, its rooms still capable of grandeur, but the vitality that once animated it had begun to dim. The mansion felt suspended, caught between its monumental past and a future that could no longer sustain such extravagance. And as the Great Depression tightened its hold on the nation, a harder truth approached, one that would force the Wanamakers and Philadelphia itself to confront the fate of America's grandest forgotten palace. By the early 1930s, the elegance of Whitemarsh Hall had begun to feel eerily out of place, a relic from a world that no longer existed. The Great Depression dragged on with merciless inertia. Breadlines lengthened in Philadelphia. Factories stood silent. Families packed their belongings into wagons and left entire neighborhoods behind. Against this backdrop, the mansion's sprawling lawns, its white limestone facade, its terraces and fountains looked less like symbols of aspiration and more like monuments to an era of extravagance the country no longer wished to remember. Inside, Fernanda waned. The grief of Rodman's death, the financial strain, the impossibility of stewarding a property so vast, it all pressed upon her with quiet, relentless force. She began spending less time in the grand rooms and more in a small sitting room overlooking the South Gardens, where she read letters from the estate's managers detailing the rising cost of upkeep. Heating alone, coal burned by the ton, had become an annual burden equivalent to the wages of several families. Repairs multiplied, roof tiles loosened, guttering sagged. Mice found their way into corners once patrolled by armies of staff. When discussions began about the mansion's future, they were cautious at first. Some proposed selling a portion of the land. Others suggested closing the house temporarily. But each solution failed in the face of the same unyielding truth. Whitemarsh Hall was too large, too costly, too demanding for any family, even one as storied as the Wanamakers, to maintain in a nation rebuilding itself from ashes. Then came the moment few believed would ever arrive. With the estate faltering and no viable plan to preserve the house, Fernanda accepted the impossible. She authorized its closure and eventually its sale. The mansion, once a monument to permanence, had become unsustainable. The decision rippled quietly through Philadelphia. Some expressed shock, others felt relief. A few mourned what they recognized as one of America's architectural masterpieces slipping toward oblivion. But the full weight of that choice would not be understood until the first work crews arrived, when the fate of Whitemarsh Hall shifted from uncertain stewardship to imminent destruction. The first blow landed on a gray morning in 1939, long before the sun had gathered enough strength to warm the dew on the grass. A wrecking ball, dark, pitted, and swinging on a cable that groaned under its own weight, arced toward the limestone facade with a sickening inevitability. Workers stood in silence as it struck. The sound was not a clean shatter, but a deep, wounded thud, as though the mansion itself exhaled in disbelief. Dust billowed upward in pale clouds, drifting across the lawns where carriages once waited and orchestras once played beneath lantern-lit summer skies. Neighbors gathered along the road, clutching their coats against the breeze, watching the giant fall in slow, reluctant stages. Some shook their heads, unable to reconcile the destruction with memories of glittering receptions and gardens manicured to perfection. Others whispered that the house had always been too large, too costly, too proud, an emblem of a world that had collapsed under its own weight. But even they fell quiet when the marble staircase, once the spine of the house, cracked down its center, sending shards skittering across the debris-strewn floor like the last remnants of a dynasty. Inside, murals peeled as walls crumbled. Ornate moldings snapped like brittle bones. Heavy doors, carved by artisans flown in from Europe, splintered under the repeated blows. The demolition crew, hardened men accustomed to tearing down old factories and warehouses, moved with uncharacteristic hesitation. One later recalled that it felt like dismantling a cathedral with our bare hands. Piece by piece, Whitemarsh Hall dissolved into rubble. Where once there were galleries large enough for orchestras, there now lay heaps of stone and twisted wire. Where gardens had stretched toward the horizon, trucks hauled away debris under a haze of drifting dust. And when the final wall toppled, its echo carried across the empty grounds, a reminder of all that had been lost and all that remained only in memory. Yet even in its ruin, something endured. Whitemarsh Hall refused to disappear quietly. A shadow lingered, a presence felt by anyone who walked the grounds where the mansion once stood, a ghost that would follow the land into its uncertain final chapter. When the last truck rumbled down the long drive in the spring of 1940, the land fell silent in a way it had never been before. No workers' shouts, no clipped footsteps of footmen, no murmurs floating from terraced gardens, only wind. It hissed through the empty fields, brushing over scattered fragments of limestone that glowed faintly in the late afternoon sun. Where Whitemarsh Hall had once dominated the horizon, its facade stretching with aristocratic certainty across 300 feet, there was now only sky, wide and unbroken. Locals said the absence felt heavier than the mansion itself. Children who had grown up seeing the colossal silhouette from distant hills now stared at the vacancy as though expecting the house to reappear at dusk, like a mirage drawn back into being. Older residents walked the grounds with slowed steps, recalling the glow of lanterns on summer nights, or the quiet pride with which the Wanamakers had once opened their doors to charitable events, orchestral performances, and civic gatherings. Memory, it seemed, clung to the air long after stone and marble were gone. Developers arrived soon enough, their plans practical, unimaginative, rows of houses, streets neatly gridded, a suburb extending into the footprint of what had been one of America's greatest private residences. Bulldozers leveled what remained of the terraces. Survey stakes pierced the earth where gardens once breathed with life. Yet even as foundations for new homes were poured, workers reported strange sensations, echoes where none should exist, a sudden chill under a wide noon sun, the fleeting impression of walls blocking a path that was now open field. Today, nothing of Whitemarsh Hall stands above ground. Not a column, not a cornice, not a trace of its vast staircases or its marble rooms. And yet, the land remembers. Photographs surface, myths endure, and historians wander the site with a kind of reverence, tracing the invisible floor plan of a giant America refused to save. For though the mansion is gone, its shadow never left, lingering like a question about what this country chooses to build and what it so quickly allows to vanish.